Jury goes easy on pistol packer convicted of killing best friend's stepdad. So there's so many people involved in this incident that I've gone through this news report and replaced their actual names with their categories. So defendant, victim, friend. Otherwise, it was very confusing to keep track of what was going on. But let's jump into this. So Rudy Pardo, that was the defendant, has no criminal record, has apologized, and deserves sympathy. His attorney told the Bexar County, Texas jury that convicted him of murder for killing his best friend's stepfather. You see all the actors in this play. Jurors took just over 2 hours Thursday to sentence the defendant, 27, to 6 years in prison, 1 year more than the minimum term for the first-degree felony. So one thing to note here is that there's very few U.S. states in which the jury has anything to do with sentencing. Normally, the jury is only involved in the guilt phase of a trial. They determine guilty or not guilty. After that, their job is done. They usually have no idea what the sentences are for the crime they're finding the defendant guilty of, and they're not supposed to know. They're instructed to not even take that into consideration, should they happen to know. The one exception, if it's a death penalty case, that always has to be, capital punishment has to be affirmed by a jury everywhere. But in most states, the judge sentences. The jury has nothing to do with sentencing. Texas is one of those exceptions. Here, the jury made a determination on the sentence for this defendant. They could have chosen anything between 5 years and 99 years in prison after finding him guilty of the crime of murder. And they chose to sentence him to 6 years. Continuing, the jury had taken more than 4 hours to find him guilty Wednesday in the fatal shooting of Kevin Osborne, henceforth victim, during a confrontation between the victim and his stepson, Pardo's friend. That would be Orion Herrera, who will be known here as friend. Pardo, the defendant, had faced 5 to 99 years or life in prison. The defendant and his friend, Orion Herrera, both brought loaded handguns to a house on the west side where the victim had gone to seek his mother-in-law's help in patching up a fight with his wife early on February 19th, 2023. So many people. So they say the victim went to this house to get help in patching up a fight with his wife. In fact, the people in the house did not want him there. The people in the house called the defendant and the defendant's friend to the house to help keep the man who would be the victim out of the house. The friend was the victim's stepson. So the friend and the victim get into a chest-bumping confrontation in the driveway, and the defendant intervened. So getting into someone else's fight on behalf of his friend, right? That must be a good thing. The defendant testified that the victim punched him, that he pushed the victim back and fired one shot in self-defense when the victim kept advancing. So what do we have here? We have a traditional fistfight, which the courts will invariably treat as non-deadly force absent aggravating factors like a disparity in size, strength, or fighting ability, or a weapon being displayed, or some exceptional vulnerability to harm. And that last one will come into play here. Generally speaking, you cannot use deadly force to stop a non-deadly force act of aggression. So generally speaking, you can't use a gun against a thrown fist, absent one of those types of aggravating factors. The friend and the victim, let's see, already covered that. The friend testified with much the same story. By the way, the defendant testified, so he took the stand in his own defense. The friend testified with much the same story, except for the punching part. The victim was aggressive and made verbal threats, but was unarmed, he said. No punches were visible in video taken of the incident from surveillance cameras across the street at Memorial High School. So keep in mind, folks, there's almost always video these days. At least you have to presume there's almost always video. The victim's relatives were silent as visiting Senior State District Judge Lisa Jarrett, presiding by assignment, read the jury sentence. The person who was supposed to be the judge in this case recused themselves, and so this judge was appointed in their place. We'll see more of that in a moment. We lost a beloved family member and pillar of the community, Ernest Osborne, said of his brother, the brother was the victim was a fixture in the Cadena Reeves Justice Center, that would be the courthouse, took selfies with many of the judges and lawyers, and often sat in on criminal trials because of his interest in the law. He sometimes took campaign photos of judges, and State District Judge Stephanie Boyd, whose court was assigned the case, recused herself because he had taken pictures of her and she considered him a friend. So many people loved the victim. He had an infectious smile that filled a room, the victim's brother said. The victim's brother told the defendant that he felt bad for him, that the victim's then wife was irresponsible and put defendant in danger by drawing him and his friend, the victim's stepson, into the night's dispute. You didn't need to be there, he told defendant. Two of the victim's nephews gave statements that also put blame on the victim's wife, who they said told lies about her husband and should have been charged along with the victim. So this is beginning to feel like a story where a woman got her man killed. Never happens, right? The defendant's friend, victim's stepson, testified that his mother called and instructed him to call her mother and tell her not to let the victim in her house. He told the jury he tried unsuccessfully to get a 911 dispatcher to send San Antonio police to see if he was there, so he enlisted the defendant's help and they both took their guns. Defendant testified that he suffered from psoriasis on 90% of his body, and the victim's punches caused immense pain. So this is his lawyer's effort to get to some exceptional vulnerability to harm, one of those aggravating factors that could make a traditional fistfight into something more, something that might justify the use of deadly force in self-defense. Obviously, it didn't work, this argument, because the jury still found him guilty of murder. So clearly they decided it was not self-defense. I was trying to shoot in the abdomen or higher leg, he testified Wednesday through tears. I didn't want the worst to happen. That was the defendant. Using an overhead projector, defense attorney Anton Hajic III showed the jury a hand-drawn chart that listed the number 5 with a dotted line to 99/life. Underneath 5 years, he wrote the word sympathy. Toward the top range, he wrote rehabilitation. So this is the defense attorney. I ask that you be sympathetic, the defense attorney told the jury before they deliberated the sentence. In his closing argument, prosecutor Jason Garahan told the jury that sentencing Pardo to the minimum would be highly inappropriate. I'm not going to compare this defendant to an axe murderer, Garahan told the panel. That's 99 years or life, but he took away the victim that day from his family. And here's the main point for today's show, folks. The prosecutor pointed out that the defendant and his friend carried guns without ever taking courses to learn to use them properly and to educate themselves on what constitutes self-defense. These are people walking around to choose who lives or dies, Garahan told the jury. Defendant is that individual, just like his friends, walking around with guns, not knowing the law. It's dangerous. The defendant will have to serve at least 3 years of the 6, 50%. Before he is eligible for parole, he received credit for time served in the Bexar County Jail. So, the bold part here. The prosecutor pointed out the defendant and his friends carried guns without ever taking courses to learn to use them properly and to educate themselves on what constitutes self-defense. He didn't get my book. Oh, no. This defendant didn't get my book. He should have gotten the book. He probably would have kept him from killing somebody that day. But the question for all of you folks is, what do you think this prosecutor would have said to the jury if this defendant had read my book? What do you think the prosecutor would have said to this jury if this defendant had taken shooting classes with a handgun? Well, then what he would have said is, this defendant planned for years to use this gun to kill. After all, he took all those shooting courses to make sure everything would go right and that he'd fire a fatal shot into this poor victim. And if he'd read my book, taken one of my courses, watched my content, the prosecutor would have said, Yeah, sure. This defendant, he knew what to say to the police, and he knew what to say to you when he testified, because he'd prepared to kill. He'd prepared his legal defense before he ever showed up there that night. That's how he knew the magic words to say. But it's all a fabrication. Of course, that's what he would say. That's what they always say. Whatever your choice is, it's the wrong choice. So if the question is ever, can X be used against me in court? The answer is always yes.